Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm here to review Newcastle's defeat at Everton last night. It's currently Friday evening, sort of 4 o'clock-ish, and also to look ahead to Newcastle's trip to Tottenham on Sunday. As I said in the video, it was about what Newcastle did and if they showed up, and too often this season in these away games they start quite slowly. They don't really, they take time to build momentum, and then that allows the other team to get chances. The only reason why Everton weren't ahead further in the game was because of their missed chances, which is kind of a theme of their home form. That's why they've been so poor at Goodison Park this season as opposed to away from home where they've recently picked up points. It's because they don't really take their chances, and that was the kind of the theme of the first half, where Newcastle had that Almiron chance settled by Joe Linton. But apart from that, they didn't get Isak into the game at all, and that carried on into the second half, and it really felt like it was going to be a mistake from either team that sort of won the game for whoever came out on top, and that was what it was. Kieran Trippier has been absolutely fantastic for Newcastle. For me, he's one of the top 5 players I've ever seen play for the club, and that's got to be remembered in times like this where he's had another poor game, just as he did at Bournemouth, just as he did at Wolves as well. When and you can say tiredness, but those mistakes, mental and physical fatigue, have come into play there. Dwight McNeil scored, then Abdoulaye Doucouré scored again from another mistake by Trippier, and then Beto wraps it up in stoppage time. 3-0 probably flattered Everton in terms of the flow of the game, because obviously it was 79 minutes and it was 0-0. Newcastle were still in with a chance, but that's kind of, as I say, kind of been the theme away from home. If you take away the PSG game and the Sheffield United 8-0, they've kind of all gone in the same pattern, and they've all played out that same way. When Newcastle don't build that momentum, they don't impose themselves like they do on their home games. There's no bits of the game where they really find themselves in the ascendancy for long periods, and that ultimately means that these bits of quality or mistakes that happen, it was bits of quality in the Bournemouth game, it was bits of quality in the Brighton game, but it was mistakes yesterday. It was mistakes against Wolves as well, rather than anything else. I think that's going to ultimately stop Newcastle qualifying for the Champions League, if anything does, because at the moment their home form is what's keeping them in that race. And as I said, I think I said on Twitter yesterday that it would have been a point if they get 3 points on Sunday at Spurs, they'd be a point behind. It was pointed out to me that I was a game behind with that, and they got their 33 points. They got 33 points after 16 games by beating Leicester on Boxing Day. It was they went to 30 points after 15 games after beating Chelsea just before the World Cup. They're currently on 26 after 15 games. When you consider, though, the point I was still making still rings true, when you consider the fact that they've had all these Champions League games, they've had all these injuries and all the things that probably are linked in that regard. And they've had such tough cup games. They've got another one coming up against Chelsea. It's not really stopped. They've never really had a run of games where you could say that they can rest players, and even if they did want to rest players, they haven't been able to because of the injuries. So it's been full on all season. To be only a handful of points behind where they were at this stage, it's really an achievement. The only difference is that other teams have caught up. Aston Villa look like where Newcastle were last season. You've got Tottenham in there as well. Liverpool have reborn. Manchester City will be, for me, still top of the pile by the end of the season. Arsenal are as threatening as they were a year ago. And Manchester United, Eric Ten Hag, for all the talk of how poor Manchester United have been and this season, he won Manager of the Month because they've been on good form in terms of picking up points recently. So they're still in with a shout. Brighton, West Ham, now 2 points behind after their win at Tottenham last night, 2 points behind Newcastle. And then you've got Chelsea. That's 10 teams, all you could make a case for being in the race for the top 6 this season. And that just shows you the sort of margin for error in the Premier League when these games come along. And yes, tiredness was a factor yesterday for Newcastle, but you've got to say that the recurring nature of these away games is a worry. Looking ahead to Sunday then, I think Newcastle shouldn't be too downhearted, given that Spurs also, as I mentioned earlier, they lost to West Ham, and they have taken the lead for 5 games in a row and not won any of them. First time it's ever happened in the Premier League. So it's not a game where Newcastle will think to themselves that they've got no chance, but there is going to be, it was a reality check at Goodison Park, just as it was at the Vitality against Bournemouth a few weeks ago. It's just one of those games where you kind of think, maybe things are catching up with them. But I think if they've learned anything, they'll learn to start fast. And the thing that they have shown, as I've mentioned before, that they do have is energy. And I don't think I don't think it was a lack of energy and fitness. I didn't think Newcastle looked particularly tired across the game. I think it was more a sort of tactical choice to understand what Everton were going to try and do, and try and suck the life out of them, and hit them on the counter attack and build themselves into the game. They've tried that against Brentford at home and Burnley at home this season. I think that is a progression that Eddie Howe's trying to bring into Newcastle, is in these games to try and win them in a different way. I don't think it was a case that they couldn't step it up in the way that it was against Bournemouth. I think it was more that Everton sort of beat Newcastle in pretty much every department. Spurs have got injuries of their own. They've got injuries to key players as well. Mickey van der Ven at the back and James Maddison are the obvious two that have, and it's since they've gone off injured against Chelsea that Spurs' slump has really started. And you know, Ange Postecoglou was the talk of the town, 3 or 4 weeks ago. People talking about Spurs possibly winning the titles. People talking about where Spurs' ceiling was, and that's all changed because those two players are injured, and they've made similar mistakes in games where they've started quickly and not carried it through. I think if Newcastle can be the ones who make that start and don't give them a second's piece, then they can take the game away from Spurs. That's possible, but at the same time, it's still likely to be the same number of players. There are a couple of potential recoveries in the shape of Sean Longstaff and Sven Botman, who are the closest. Callum Wilson's in that bracket too, but I'm not convinced that they'll be ready to play much of a part on Sunday at Spurs. I think Milan and Fulham are more likely dates for their returns, but things are starting to ease off. If Newcastle can get through the game, get another point, that wouldn't be the end of the world. 3 points would be obviously fantastic, but there is a sort of element of realism about where Newcastle are at the moment now, because it will be a 5th game in a row where the same team has played. And it's not just the fact that these players are tired, it's the fact that that there's nothing on the bench to really change anything. And that's just the reality of where, as I say, of what Newcastle have got to deal with. What they have to do, I think, to improve on Everton is to start quicker and start with more purpose, not allow these teams to settle into a pace and build their own momentum, because that's the sort of pattern of these away games that's been a troublesome issue for Newcastle. I think, if they can get a result on Sunday, then it kind of cancels out that result against Everton, and Newcastle probably where they are on, where you would imagine they'd be on par, because I think a lot of people probably expect them to lose this game. But I think Spurs have got similar issues. I think they've got injuries of their own. They've got confidence issues. The level of influence that James Maddison has had on that team is blatantly obvious since he's been injured, in a similar way to sort of Bruno for Newcastle and Anthony Gordon for Newcastle. And the other thing I want to touch on just before I go is, I thought the occasion got to Anthony Gordon last night. I thought he really, I said that he was due a good performance back at Goodison, but he snapped at everything. His decisions were poor. He had chances that he didn't take, and I think that was just a reflection of how emotionally charged that game was. The fans were on his back, as you would imagine, and yeah, it was just one of those games for him. But you got to look positively. As I said, they're only a handful of points behind where they were at this stage last season. It's a much tighter race. There's much less margin for error. Newcastle's squad is a lot more threadbare, but this is another challenge that you've got to rise to. As I say, it's been amazing how intense the games have been, just because of how big they've all been, really, in terms of every cup game has been huge, every Champions League game has been huge, and that takes a mental toll. But the great thing about Eddie Howe is he hasn't used that as an excuse. It naturally has to be sort of taken into account as just a factor, not an excuse, just a reason as to why things are happening, in the same way as it would affect every team. But at the end of the day, that's just nature of football, and you've got to take it in your stride. They didn't do enough of what they're good at Everton, and they haven't done that away from home. So yeah, tough game coming up on Sunday. It's a really interesting one to see how they get on, and then on to Milan on Wednesday. I'll be at that game as well, and I'll bring you something from there. So please continue to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.